Hello, my name is Greg Endres. I work as a Ndsu Extension Cropping System Specialist out of the Carrington Research Extension Center. Today I'm going to spend some time visiting with you as part of the Lake Region Roundup on the subject of soybean production research and recommendations. So with that, I'm going to turn to my screen and we'll start the discussion. So the presentation is one of three during a 1 hour period that talks about soybean production research and recommendations. So during my discussion, I'll be answering a few questions, but before I start, I'd like to mention that we have a new Ndsu Extension Circular that's been revised just recently. And the title is Display the Soybean Growth and Management Quick Guide. So we encourage soybean growers to get a copy of this, either a hard copy or electronic copy, and study it, because it's important to know the biology of the soybean plant. That'll help give you some tools to as you manage your soybean during the 2022 production year. To find this on the web, I listed keywords of Ndsu soybean growth. So the questions that I'd like to answer regarding soybean production are as follows. In the category of soybean plant establishment, I'd like to answer the question of what are Ndsu's current guidelines on plant populations plus row spacings? What is the guidelines on that combination? And then second one is very simply, can I effectively grow soybean on saline soils? I hope you know the answer to that. We'll give you some information to help you manage this saline soils. And then another question to be answered is, if you're using rye as a cover crop before soybean, what is the best planting date and rate the previous fall before soybeans are produced to maximize the utility of the rye as a cover crop and realize its benefits? So let's start with the two questions in soybean plant establishment. And actually, before I do, I want to show you this table. I've showed this numerous times during meetings, but I think it's really important and a nice basis to start the discussion on plant establishment. This is a compilation of 9 factors on establishing soybean. And there's option A and option B. We suggest that you use option A column because of the yield increase that's listed for each of the 9 factors. And this is based on the number of trials that are listed on the far right-hand column. During my discussion, I'll talk specifically about planting rates and row spacing, as I mentioned earlier. So that's why those factors are highlighted in green. So just as an example on how to use this table, for example, in tillage systems, we found that combined over 37 trials, that when a person used some level of reduced till, it might be strip tillage, it might be just conservation tillage, no till, we saw an average of 4% yield increase compared to conventional till. So with this table, it's a starting point for you as you consider management of each soybean field. It's not an ending point, but a starting point. Use this information and then fine tune as needed. All right, so the first question I wanted to answer was, what are Ndsu's guidelines on soybean planting rates and row spacings? So Ndsu over a long period has had the recommendation for early season soybean plant stand of 150,000 plants per acre. And this is across row spacings. Ndsu has been doing work with this combination of factors or with both factors, sometimes alone, sometimes a combination, for over 2 decades. It actually started in the late 1990s. And so we've compiled a tremendous amount of data, and we thought it'd be very important to compile the data and see if we can have a more precise guide for establishing your soybean stands. So we did this work, the data evaluation, and writing up the results in 2020. And so I want to give you a very brief summary or overview of what we discovered compiling the data. And this is data from 37 trials conducted across the state during the period of 2008 through 2019. And so here's the results of our work. We have Extension Circular, and that's available to you electronically or in hard copy. If you look for the electronic copy, simply search the web for the keywords of Ndsu soybean rates and rows. So what is the summary? So we looked at East and West North Dakota, and we looked at the factors individually, but for today's discussion, I just want to mention our summary for Eastern North Dakota, and that is that narrow rows were definitely out-yielded the wide rows, along with the use of planting 170,000 pure lye seeds per acre. This provided optimum yield. If by chance a person is planting in wide rows, that would be essentially at 30 inches, then the planting rates in the database actually are higher than with narrow rows. And we found with this extensive database that the optimum yield was when we had 190,000 pure lye seeds planted per acre. Keep in mind that the above planting rates are for optimum yield. Certainly you need to consider economics, specifically seed costs, as they determine what's the best planting rate, as well as row spacing for your farm and for your fields. So the planting information for Eastern North Dakota, we'll choose the narrow row spacings, 170,000 pure lye seeds per acre planting rate. And then we know that even using pure lye seed as a recommendation, we do have some field losses. And for easy figuring, we'll use a 10% loss. And that's, of course, a loss from planting time up to the estimated early season, which normally is from 3 to 4 weeks after planting. So what's very interesting is using narrow rows, 170,000 pure lye seeds per acre, a 10% early season plant loss, we come up with 153,000 plants per acre established. And note that that's very close to what our long-term traditional recommendation has been. And that's all I'll say about our current guidelines. Okay, next I'm going to talk a bit about plant nutrition and soil management. And a couple years ago, we revised our soybean soil fertility guide. This is a picture of the front cover, plus the keywords for a web search. And so we'd strongly recommend, if you do not have a copy of this, to get one, especially considering the high fertilizer costs that we're dealing with as we go into the cropping season. Within soil management, we're very concerned about the acreage in the state where soybeans are planted where they probably shouldn't be. And that's due to saline soils. So we have a very nice circular. It's only a couple years old, easy to read, and very useful as you try to manage saline soils and have soybeans as part of your crop rotation. In table 1 within the guide shows the tolerance of many crops, the minimum threshold for tolerating salinity, and then as well as the estimated yield reduction as salinity levels goes up. And so the scale here is that it's using a 1-to-1 electrical conductivity test. And so note soybean, very low tolerance to saline soils, only a 0.6 EC. And if we go to up to 1 EC, no, that's where you hit 10% yield reduction. And it certainly gets worse with really a modest gain in ECs. Compare that, for example, with barley. With barley, the threshold surprisingly is not that much higher, but it was that too. And to get a 10% yield loss, we would go to 3 EC. So certainly, as everyone knows, barley is more tolerant as compared to soybean, and a better choice if we have any knowledge that our soils may have high elevated levels of salts. So this is what we want to avoid. I know it's easy to just plant across maybe a fairly small section of a field that we suspect has salts present, but the problem is that we're losing money on this. We're having great expense based on the 2021 Northeast North Dakota soybean budget of direct costs. We're losing $160 an acre by planting into salt-affected soils with no return. So we can't have this. What we recommend is to soil sample these areas, determine what the EC is, and then plant the appropriate crop, hopefully a cash crop, maybe such as malting or even feed barley, which has, again, more tolerance, or maybe some other crops that have greater tolerance. If the EC levels are too high, well, then maybe we even have to go to a perennial grass for a short term before moving to a cash crop. So please soil test and make appropriate decisions instead of losing money by planting our expensive inputs for soybean production. Okay, the last subject I want to talk about is if a person chooses to use winter rye as a cover crop before soybean. There's a lot of interest in cover crops, including in winter rye. And so we started a study several years ago to look at two factors. They are the planting dates in the fall, as well as planting rates. And so this work was actually started in the fall of 2018. We've completed 3 years, and we're in the process of working on that 4th year of data. So we're trying to answer the question, if a person is planting rye in the fall, what time should they plant and what rate should they plant? And we're working on answers, but before we get answers, we have to ask some more questions of the producer. Primarily, what are your goals with the cover crop? And we had hoped that they say would be for ground cover to reduce soil erosion. It might be for soil moisture management. It likely is for some weed suppression. Maybe for some livestock feed. So there's a lot of reasons to consider using rye preceding soybean. So we wanted to generate some numbers to help answer that question. What's the best date and rate for planting winter rye in the fall based on a producer's goals? So this picture is from the study that was taken in June 2020. And I'll show you the planting dates as well as the rates that we've used in the study at this time. So this is a look at the winter rye stand and ground cover that we ended up with, and this is a 3-year average. Note the dates. We started planting fairly late the first 2 years, October 2nd or late September, and then the second dates were especially late, the end of October and even November 1st during these 2 years. Note our planting rates from 25 to 75 pounds. And what's most important is our established rye stand. And these measurements were taken in May of the following spring before the soybeans are planted. And note, even with the highest rate where we planted earlier with a high planting rate and ended up with over 600,000 plants per acre, or about 15 plants per square foot, we still had really minimal ground cover. So it's really important to if ground cover, reduction of soil erosion is important to you, to get as many plants out there as is feasible. Weed suppression is another factor that we measured in the study. This is a look at our 2020 trial. Note the planting dates, late September and the 1st of November. And notice we had foxtail and kochia suppression measured. And we start to see some impact on control of these weeds when we had substantial rye plant densities. When we had rye plant densities that range from, with planting rates of 50 to 75 pounds, and of course planted in September. Note that the plants per square foot were 18 to 26. Before we reached levels where we'd be satisfied, at least somewhat satisfied with suppressing these weeds. Also note that when we planted late, even though we achieved some populations that were similar to the earlier planting date, but a lower rate, note that weed suppression was very low. And that's because of planting so late, there was no fall growth, and the growth was delayed in the spring. So that's why the difference, even though plant densities are similar, weed suppression was poor. This is a look at 2 years of data on foxtail suppression from the study. And note that when we averaged the 2 years, that we did have lower plant densities of the rye. The highest we had was 15 plants per square foot. And notice that we really had no difference in foxtail suppression amongst the various rye densities. And so this really points out the importance of having some adequate rye levels if weed suppression is a goal that you have when using rye as a cover crop. And then, of course, you might be interested in what's the impact on soybean. And so this is 3-year average. And what we found on soybean plant development, where we noted the emergence of the soybean plants, flowering time, and maturity, as well as canopy closure, that they're generally quite similar amongst the treatments. As a follow-up, the soybean plant density was very adequate with all the treatments. Again, this was averaged over 3 years, and note soybean yield was very satisfactory in the mid-40s. And so we feel that when managed correctly, the rye will have no negative impact on the soybean, but have certainly positive impacts on for some of the goals you might have with rye as a cover crop. To summarize our work after the first 3 years, ground cover, we'd encourage you to plant early and plant at the highest rate, certainly to achieve greater than 500,000 plants per acre. On weed control, 2020 was our key year, and where we saw differences in treatments, and that's because we had higher plant densities. And so we found that with foxtail, we should plant earlier, plant in September with a higher rate, and try to achieve over 1 million plants per acre. With kochia, we did find that maybe we can go down a little bit on planting rates, but still plant early and try to achieve greater than 3/4 million plants per acre. And again, soybean plant development and seed yield were similar among treatments as long as the cover crop was managed correctly. In other words, terminated on a timely basis, so it did not steal moisture that soybean plants needed for optimum stands and ultimately yield. And so that covers some of the comments I have on recent research and not so recent research in the state that helps you as you make plans for establishing soybeans in 2022.